So I ask people to sit down for the last session, please. So for the last session in our symposium, we'll be looking at declassification initiatives. So clearly things have been building to this point. A lot of the discussion so far has been how the ATIP system might be improved. But really we all recognize that ATIP is not suited for historic records of the kind that we were talking about. So really the only long-term solution is some kind of declassification system. So I'm very pleased to have this panel here today to talk about declassification initiatives and what may be coming down the road. So I'd like to introduce Thomas Junot, who will be chairing this session, and
Thank you very much, Alan. Thank you very much, everyone, and welcome to the last session. I'm very happy to act as the moderator for this session. I'm a professor at the University of Ottawa at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. Some of my research focuses on the Middle East, other half of my research more on the national security side, including on transparency issues, and this is where I'm very happy to be here today. For 3 years, from 2019 to 22, I was the co-chair of the National Security Transparency Advisory Group, working with Leslie and her team very closely, and have become very interested since then in transparency issues. So with us today for a very promising last session, we have three speakers. First will be Leslie Soper from Public Safety Canada. She is the Director General of the National Security Policy Team in the National and Cybersecurity Branch. Second up will be Charles Taillefer, who is the Executive Director of the Access to Information Policy and Performance Division with Treasury Board. And third will be Marcelle Cinq-Mars, who is the Lead Archivist on Declassification at Library and Archives Canada. Before we start, Alan and Tim asked me to just say a few words to set the stage. So, as we discussed amply in the first few sessions today, and as everyone here knows, Canada does not have a mechanism for the declassification of historic records after a certain period of time. We are, as we all know, the only member of the Five Eyes without such a mechanism. In parallel, the ATIP system is inadequate to access the mass of historic records in the hands of LAC, and also inadequate for current non-historical documents and records with other departments. So without a systematic declassification process, without a more functional ATI process, large amounts of historical and current data will not be accessible to researchers. So for all practical purposes, it is lost. That's a problem for researchers, and that matters. But researchers are not exactly a powerful political constituency that can mobilize for change, typically. But it matters to say that it's also a problem for society more broadly. In a healthy democracy, I think we all agree that the health of democracy relies on valuable, accurate, relevant information about government being available not just to researchers, but also to the media, to civil society, and to opposition parties. This is essential to scrutinize government. It's essential to hold government to account, to shine a light on weaknesses, on mistakes, on abuses of power, past but also current. So a system at the ATI level, at the declassification level, without enough transparency, not only leads to a failure to shine lights on these issues, mistakes, abuses of power, weaknesses, and therefore it weakens systems of accountability, which are or should be at the center of democratic debate. But it also, because there is a widespread understanding, sometimes tacit but sometimes explicit, that this is the reality, the suboptimal reality, but that it is the reality, it feeds a culture of complacency or of risk aversion or of stagnation in some cases, which weakens accountability mechanisms themselves. So, on this not very optimistic note, our topic for this last session is to try to change that. So on that, we have three very good speakers to address these challenges, starting with Leslie.
Thank you, Tom. So I'm Leslie Silver. I'm the Director General of National Security Policy at Public Safety Canada, and in that capacity we have an overarching role to work with the national security community around issues of interest. But where we sort of drilled into the declassification question, it's really driven out of this government's drive towards transparency broadly in the national security space. So people may recall that in 2017, then Minister of Public Safety, Ralph Goodale, announced the transparency commitment, of which one of the key pillars is information transparency. So it's with that backdrop that work has gone on within the community to try to look at solutions to what has been a problem many, many decades in the making for Canada to get to the release of important historic records that sit within the government vaults and basements and records rooms, etc. I'm personally motivated. I look back at my own history as a public servant. I worked in the Privy Council office. I was responsible for doing ATI reviews of cabinet records that would be sought under access to information. And I recall a particular request that related to the cabinet record pertaining to the October crisis. And I recall thinking, well, gosh, here I am in 2010. These would be in the historic interest to release. And so I waived, I thought it would be in the, public interest to waive Fed-Prov interests. And, I enthusiastically took the whole document and presented it to my leadership at the time and said, we should really release this. To which I got we will not be doing that. So, fundamentally, I think we have underpinning declassification is there's a risk aversion, a cultural barrier to overcome. That was immediately evident to me when I came into my role and was charged with taking forward this information transparency piece of the transparency commitment. So what I want to talk about is really what we've done since then. So in the early days, we plumbed the depths of the challenges within the ATI system, and I don't need to sort of recount all the barriers to that. But in the first instance, it's a bit of a Groundhog Day process. We have lovely people like Ellen Barnes seeking access to information on historic records. They might have multiple departments that have equities in relation to the classified interests that are at play in the document. So we do our diligence months later, after each department has had their review, some of it inconsistent. One department will apply one level of redactions, another will apply another level of redactions. Some of them have access to Alan Barnes's tool to find out that the record has actually already been released in the public domain, either here in Canada or in another jurisdiction. At the end of that process, it then goes out to the requester full of black lines, and then, of course, 2 years later, it never gets translated. So it can't be put on a public website, it can't go onto open government, it can't be handled and manipulated by the Library and Archives as a permanent release of the record. And then 2 years later, we do the same process all over again for the same record. So in short, I think we all were seized of the problem of how ATI is not fit for purpose in terms of declassification. So I think the second major challenge is the sheer, you know, as I said, this is a problem decades in the making, the sheer scale of the challenge now to go back and do the work of looking at our records and applying redactions and has been formidable, particularly for specific departments like Global Affairs Canada, for Department of Defense. So we commissioned a short study, a pilot, back in 2022 when it wrapped up, to sort of test our principles around declassification, what should a declassification framework look like, and test whether or not we had commonality of culture between organizations within the national security community that we could collectively move forward with sort of a rule book for how to do this better while we await what Charles is going to talk about in the as the policy framework. What we discovered is, in fact, it's a volumetric problem more than a redaction problem. That in many of the records, particularly within the historic holdings, and we were looking specifically at the Joint Intelligence Committee records that are held by PCO between the 1950s, so the late 40s and 1960. The vast majority of the content was releasable, but obviously the barriers that are sort of enumerated in our report on that were that even if we release them, we would still need to have every deputy head's function through ATI to sign off. There would be no system upon which, until they're passed over to the Library and Archives, there was no system in which we could make them permanently available to researchers. So this was just a microcosm of the many records that exist inside our holdings, either departmentally or within Library and Archives. But I do have hope. I think what I would say from where we're standing today is that the whole of the government community is seized with these questions around what is a better policy framework for declassification, for access to information, and that the results and the ideas that were brought forward through that process hopefully are contributing to policy work that Treasury Board Secretariat is looking at. I think I will stop my remarks there and let Charles.
Certainly raised expectations.
Yes.
I appreciate that. Well, before I begin, I just want to acknowledge that I'm speaking today from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I'm very pleased to come here to describe some of the work that Treasury Board is doing with respect to the Access to Information Act, as well as that work relates to declassification of historical records. It's an area that I think everyone could acknowledge that over the past few years, the ATI system has been under intense scrutiny. There's been a number of reports and reviews that have identified a number of issues with the Act, poor information management, strained processing capacity, as well as unique challenges faced by Indigenous records. But one of the issues that keeps on coming back, and certainly something that the Information Commissioner has been hammering, is the issues related to declassification and opening of records. And I do kind of bring that nuance in terms of, as the discussion this morning had kind of made that nuance between declassifying records and opening records. And I think it is an important nuance. We're focused, obviously, on both areas. I recently inherited the open government team, so now I have access to information and open government. So, and obviously there are policy linkages between that. And maybe for those who don't know, our policy group directly supports the President of the Treasury Board in her role as designated minister under the Act. The President of the Treasury Board has a number of actual responsibilities under that Act, including reporting, issuing policy and guidance, forms related to the Act. So there's actual operational responsibilities that my team fulfills. And one of those was as a result of C-58, there was a mandated review of the Act. So last December, the report, the Access to Information Review Report, was tabled in Parliament. So the review began in 2020. And it really did a comprehensive review of the system, not just the legislation itself. So during that process, again, declassification was identified as a key area for increasing accountability and transparency. And it did note, as no surprise to anybody, that agencies do not regularly assess their records for classification. So I think in a lot of the conclusions of the report, it reflected what was well known, I think, for a long time by any researcher, but nevertheless, the report does state it. But I think what's very important to note is that one of the conclusions, so the conclusions related to declassification is actually fairly strong in its wording, and it says that a systemic approach to declassification would support government transparency and accountability, enhance access to Canada's history, and improve the agility of the ATI regime and the security of information systems. So that is a pretty strong acknowledgement, I think, of that the issues that were identified and the obvious benefits from looking at not only best practices surrounding declassification, but a more systemic approach. So at Treasury Board, we've obviously been tracking all of the activity, certainly the witnesses that appeared before FE. Declassification was raised, I think, by almost every witness that appeared before the committee. So it's a policy issue that's difficult to ignore, and it's one that certainly, in terms of what was raised, had a high profile, and I think at many times the commissioner noted as either in the top 3 or top 5 of the issues that she wanted the government to grapple with. During the FE study, the President of the Treasury Board had committed to developing an action plan to follow up on the review report, and obviously that those efforts will do include declassification. When thinking about declassification at Treasury Board Secretary, there are obviously a number of broader policy concerns that need to be factored in. So you have privacy, information management, security, open government, and access to information. I'm primarily going to focus on access to information and security policy frameworks. The Access Act doesn't directly address declassification and security categorization. I think that's an important distinction to me. Obviously, the Act provides a right of access. The Supreme Court has said on a number of times that the quasi-constitutional nature of the Access to Information Act, it also underlined that that right of access is expressly subject to the provisions of the Act, so exemptions, exclusions. And it also indicated, and that's it also indicated in the Act under Section 4, that the Act supersedes any other Act of Parliament. So in that sense, the Act really is kind of the final word on whether information can be legitimately protected. There's obviously some concepts like solicitor-client privilege and having a confidence that reside outside the Act, but those concepts are reflected in the Access to Information Act. The other part of that framework is the direct bond security management, which contains the authority to downgrade the security category of information resources, and as we discussed, that's based on the expected injury. When the injury is reduced, you consider downgrading. And the other element that's been widely discussed is we know that through the passage of time, sensitivity is generally reduced, or the occurrence of specific events can reduce the sensitivity of information. I think the budget is always provided as the example for that. It's super secretive and then everybody knows about it. So that does come into frame. The Act, the Access to Information Act does reflect that. There are a number of sunset clauses within the Act right now. So for example, the provision related to information obtained or prepared by investigative bodies or related to lawful investigation sets a 20-year time limit on the application of that exemption. There's also a 20-year time limit on advice and account consultations to government. There's also the time limit on personal information. I think that's probably one that is a bit more difficult to overcome, because that exemption applies to information about an individual that's been dead for more than 20 years. So that can be a long time. And maybe in the future, when we're all living longer, that might need to be reviewed. There's also a number of injury tests that are provided in the exemptions themselves. And one thing I do want to note, because I do think it's not discussed a lot, but the cabinet confidences exclusion does have exceptions to it, and they're related to discussion papers. So that was a concept that existed before the Act came into being, where you had these discussion papers that would provide background information on an issue that was going to cabinet. And those discussion papers were separate from the memorandum of cabinet. Once the Act was passed, the discussion papers got integrated as part of the memorandum to cabinet. But there's been federal court decisions that have affirmed that. Ethel is one of the decisions that have said, well, you know, just because you integrate it doesn't mean that those exceptions don't apply, and you do have to apply the exceptions in terms of looking at whether the elements that would have constituted the discussion paper are present in the memorandum. So there's a lot of elements like that where the existing Act does provide a framework that certainly can be leveraged by OPIs that are looking at their records and trying to determine whether something needs to be, can be downgraded or declassified, or even opening up information. So and this is something that came up this morning. It was briefly kind of passed over, but I really do want to stop on that. And I think this theme about leveraging work and leveraging processes, I think that's fundamental, because we know that in an ATIP process, you have OPIs that, regardless of the security classification, they have to pull records, and then the necessary review work, including consultations, have to be done to assess that against the exemptive provisions of the Act, as well as the exclusions. But that process is time-consuming. It takes a lot of time. You have a release package from the Access to Information process that gets released, but right now it doesn't always get communicated back into the actual program files. So those program files should be reconsidered as a result of that process. Because what happens, and I think we've discussed it a number of times, is that you could then, 2 years later, get the request, and you go back to the program files, and you start that process over again without having benefited from the work that was previously done on the file. So these are kind of opportunities that we have, that we can work within the existing system to leverage the massive effort it takes to process information. And I think that's, like, there are likely other opportunities like that that we can further leverage existing work to make sure that it's not kind of wasted for one purpose, or not necessarily wasted, but that effort isn't maximized as much as it can be. The other thing I wanted to talk about was the ATI report itself highlighted a few areas, legislative policy measures that can contribute to either opening records or facilitating the declassification of records. And one of the areas that I think is very interesting is the public interest override, having a general public interest override. Right now, there's only public interest overrides in the Act are very limited. It's one under third-party information and then another under personal information. So that's fairly limited, and it doesn't involve consideration of perhaps there may be contexts where the public interest override could apply in other contexts. Obviously, it gets a bit more difficult when you're looking at records that have been obtained from other jurisdictions. That's very difficult to overcome because you have to respect the confidentiality that was assigned and the relationship that was fostered that allowed for that confidential exchange of information. And that tends to be where I think there is difficulty in ignoring things like consultations or even with personal information. There's a certain level of confidence that needs to be and trust that needs to be in place in order for individuals to provide government with information, but also to allow information sharing between nations. The other element, and I mentioned it before, that it does exist in the Act, sunset clauses, but, and this has been discussed in many ways today as well, that whether you have a definitive sunset clause that sets out, and the report talks about this, whether you have something that applies where, after a certain number of years, that's it, no exemptions apply to it, or whether, right now is the approach in the Act, that you have targeted sunset clause for each provision. So for example, that 20 years, maybe that can be reduced in certain, with respect to certain exemptions, or a sunset clause can be applied in the case of all exemptions. So those are, I think, interesting legislative policy options that are raised in the report, and certainly the conclusions, if you read the conclusions related to those areas, it does tout the benefit of looking at that. One of the things I think we can't ignore, and certainly I've been seeing a lot of discussion about, well, we need legislative reform, we need legislative reform. There are some pretty fundamental administrative and operational issues. The report highlights those, so I am being one of them. ATIP processing capacity being another that can't be understated. Currently across the ATIP community, we did a survey. There's like a 20% vacancy in ATIP positions. So that's why the Treasury Board put forward ATIP Community Development Office to have more regular recruitment activity. We're on our second round, and we're getting good results with that in terms of actually getting candidates in and interested in access to information. But those are equally important issues to address. Legislation and changing the rules doesn't necessarily address that. It can alleviate some of that, but you do need to look at the system very broadly. And I think the government response made that clear, that the focus would be on broad considerations that both directly and indirectly have an impact on the administration of the Act. And I think those elements that I mentioned, like information management, has, I would say, a very direct impact on the Act. And the issue that I discussed earlier about ATIP doing one thing and processing and releasing information on the one hand, and then not being reflected in the actual information holdings, that's an information management issue. So if some of that gets resolved, you can alleviate some of the pressure on the system. I would just close by saying the government response does know that there will be an opportunity very soon to improve the ATI. The next mandated review is 2025. So it has to be launched before that. Certainly the intent is, as I noted earlier, there's been intense activity, many recommendations, a lot of submissions that have been provided, and I think what we've heard in that process is a lot of stakeholders were frustrated that some of the same, they had to make some of the same recommendations every time. So obviously we've heard that, and I think we'll want to be responsive to that. So thank you.
Good afternoon. Following the recommendation of the OIC regarding declassification, the ATIP branch created a small team to try our hands at declassification, a brand new world for us. That team was created in September 22, so we're about 1 year old. For half of that time, there was a team of one, yours truly. So, and today I will give you an overview of our lesson learned, but also a lot of challenges that we encountered, still encounter, and maybe for a time until we have some declassification framework. But my vision, the general vision is that we don't have a framework that would have guidelines for departments on how to declassify. But in the meantime, that doesn't mean that they cannot, because they don't have to, but they can if they want. And that's almost, the approach that we have is that if they have the means to understand the records that we have, they might agree to declassify. Like I said, they don't have to. So I guess some of them know that too. But, that's a big. Yes. So of course the big basis of declassification is that only the creator of the records can declassify. So ADC doesn't have that authority. So we have a lot of records of many departments, agencies, and we have no power at all to declassify any of them. And I was listening to our GAC colleague, I am this morning, with a team at GAC that declassify their own records. How lucky they are. They can declassify their own records. We can't. Everything we have, and we look at the records, we know what's in them. A lot of them, according to us and according to a lot of people interested in them, could be declassified. But we have to obtain that agreement from departments. That's the unique situation of ADC, is that not only there are not our records, but there's a lot of them. It's not a lot. So, there's also, historical record, that means that they're old, so they have been transferred to ADC a long time ago in many cases. We have classified records from the 40s, from the 50s, but when they were transferred, maybe, 30 years ago, they came with a list. In some cases, that list is handwritten, and sometimes we have a title for the file, but very rarely we have the security classification. So how do we know what records are classified if it's not in the transfer list or the finding aid that we have? Well, it's different today. We have departments who will provide that information, but we're working on older historical records, and the list doesn't have it. So what do we have to do? Well, open the box, and look at the file. So that's one big challenge that we have. Okay, for some of them we know the classification, but not for all of them. I was going to say slide 2, but I would be talking to myself. First challenge that we had, and I say, sometimes we still have it, is to spread the word that declassification is not disclosure. If I was spared the time, I had to explain that I would be rich and not be here. But so disclosure is the result of a record being submitted under the ATI Act. Been reviewed, and that review at ADC will cover the review of the NSI and privacy information in the record. If everything can be disclosed, then it's disclosed regardless of the classification of the record. So the disclosure in that process under the ATI brings to the disclosure of the record. When we do declassification, it's not an access to information request at the base. It's us, employees, that decide to open a group of records, small corpus. So we don't use the Access to Information Act because it's not a request. In that case, we have no, NEC has no power to declassify, as I said. So that is, for us, the difference. Declassification is to, well, it was mentioned this morning, but it was part of my presentation. Declassification is to remove or downgrade the security level on a record. When we do that, we look at the record and we have an eye for the NSI, National Security Intelligence Information. We do not review for the privacy information. That is why, if a department agrees to declassify the record, it's not disclosed because the privacy review hasn't been done. So there was questions coming between about the difference between disclosed and declassified. So declassified, it's not automatically disclosed, not before the privacy review has been done. Yeah. So part of the first challenge that we had was to spread the gospel, because in a lot of people, not in here, but in the general population, when they hear that the record has been declassified, for them it means that it's been disclosed, and it's open to access. And I think that a lot of people mean disclosed, but they will say declassified. So it has to be clarified often. So that was the first challenge, is to have clarified. Yeah, like I mentioned, a team of one for about 6 months. Now there are 6 of us. I was threatening to have them stand up, but I'll be good, I won't do that. It's not easy to find archivists. It's not easy to find archivists. The clearance, security clearance required. You need top secret. So that was the first challenge, but that has been overcome. We have the team now. And then because there's no framework, we have to study what others do. If you, in the government of Canada, like GAP, for example, do declassification, study different type of processes for declassification, like also the NATO one. I'm not talking about systematic declassification here, but NATO also has a good idea about declassification. So the next step was to establish how we would proceed. But it's not just to select a group of records and tell the department, we think it's old, it's not, doesn't enter to the class. They need a bit more than that to get explanation. Well, the way we proceed is that since it's a new initiative, the departments don't all have people ready to receive requests for declassification. We select small groups of records, 5, 10 boxes, maybe 2 to 10 boxes, something that is covering an entire topic, ideally. We try with older records from the 50s, 60s, with low risk, according to what we think is low risk, because we are approaching departments with requests for the classification. So we will not, let's say, select records for CSC that are 10 years old, because chances of success are minimal for now. Anyway, so this work also helped to create a link of communication with the departments. So, an awareness of ADC wanting to declassify records. And I think our departments and government know that there would be a framework on declassification at some time. So why not, get used to it? We don't need to wait for it. We can start trying, because we can. So once we select a group of records that we think is low risk and should be fairly easy, but we notice that there's no easy declassification, but we try. We look at the records, we create a listing, detailed listing of the records. We then create a report. Our report is a recommendation of declassification that contains the description of the record. Yes, our recommendation. The goal is to provide the department with enough information to be able to agree. I'm not saying to disagree, I want them to agree. And because the files, the records are at ADC, and we send it to people that are in different. We cannot have people from departments coming to look at the record. So we look at it for them. That's the principle that we, for now, are trying. Yeah, and you see, it has a potential. So, yes, so we also need to document the submission to the departments and keep track of the answers, if they agree or not, because if they disagree, we'd like to know why. That will also inform on future submissions. But it also, like I said, the team is new, the classification is new at the MSC, so the team is also learning. We're developing the expertise. That's very important. We mentioned, I heard that many times today. No one is born NSI specialist. It's something, it takes time to be comfortable. I have very bright people in my team, but we still need to get to learn more, not only the history, but the process. So we are also building the expertise in the classification, because we hope and expect that framework. We want to be ready for when it comes. That's part of the idea. I also mentioned a list from the department that had no security mention at file level. We are also looking back at these files and creating a new, because sometimes it is on paperwork, on the list, but it's not very, in Excel, it's not very easy to access. So we're refreshing this information, but when we don't have the list, we're looking about. So we need to have a better understanding of classified information. Top secret records are quite well documented, what we have in which folder. But secret and confidential because they don't require a special vault altogether. We don't have that. That's good knowledge. Other part of the challenge, I talked about the submissions that we prepare for departments. So you have a submission, it's nice analysis and everything, and then you look at the department and where do I send it? Who's the person at the department that can receive it? Because if you send it to the wrong person, you would put it there. That's not, I mean, so you try to reach the right contact. The problem is that most departments don't. Most departments don't have a dedicated resource to declassification. Someday, maybe, but right now it's very hard to find them. And when you reach, because we did, establish contact with the right office or the right person, and then the question is, yes, who can sign off on that submission? Who at the department can agree? I'm like, but you should know. How would I know? Who's in charge? Who has the delegated authority? But they don't know. And when they're very active and okay, they don't know. So that's another challenge. It's a challenge for the departments that we contact, but it's a challenge for us to tell them that they should look around and see if they have the Security Information Act mentioned that the deputy head as the signing authority, but in some departments it's been delegated. I think it's delegated to level 1. For some records, like this morning at GAC, I think you're part of the delegated to be a director, but other departments have no idea. So that is a challenge. So even if the person at the department receives a submission and they, yes, we will do it, but have no idea who can sign it. It takes months for them to find it. So that is something that will have to be clarified. In the framework for each department, if, let's say, it's a wish, if each department clearly identified person in charge of receiving this request, that would help. And if they can also clarify the delegated authority in the department, that would also speed up the process. Another challenge is that, of course, we have records from national defense, GAC, PCO, hundreds. But especially in the GAC records and national defense records, we have a lot of NATO records and other allies records. And that is something that we haven't tackled yet. For now, we proceed, we work with Canadian-only records. But it is also a challenge because NATO, of course, has publicly disclosed a lot of records, and we have to check on the database to see if that's been publicly disclosed or not. So it is a lot of work. Okay, I have 50 seconds left. So these are our results so far. We submitted to 4 departments, about 10 submissions. And just to say that the active work really started like in August this year, because it took time to build a team. We've seen about 20,000 pages that have been reviewed, that are these 10 submissions. and it says 384 pages declassified, but we got another 700 yesterday, so about 1,000 pages. We work at a page since, so there's a whole. It's another word, and it's very exciting, and we love it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the speakers for having respected your time limits, in some cases gone under. I think there might be a hidden message somewhere for a session on ATI declassification, maybe. Anybody wants to start on the questions? I think there's a mic. Yes.
I can use my voice. There you go. What is the hands talking? It's an audio device. Oh, okay. Thank you. Okay, it's just Rob again. I have a kind of a blunt old soldier question. So, is Canada actually going to create a declassification policy and guidelines that we can use for accessing intelligence information? I've heard 3 to 4 times today that we're the only ones that don't. The tendency that I've had in my 40 years within the community is that we'll take somebody else's information, we'll take their policy and guidelines, put Canada's name on it, and we're good to go. I mean, are we looking at that? Who does the buck stop with? And when would we actually expect a declassification policy and guidelines to be promulgated? I know, case in point, Afghanistan 2002, I worked in a joint environment, intelligence-wise. I know that the information I produced I can look at potentially in 2032. Bingo. Why do we not look at that? Is it too hard? Is it nobody wants to tackle the challenge? If you say, you said, Marcelle, it's up to the originator to declassify. The information I'm looking for, the originator's been dead for 40 years. So who are you going to ask to declassify this material who has no clue about it? So I'm an old, frustrated guy, new in the research domain, but what are we doing about it aside? You know, the ATI is going to deal with a review in 2 years. There's no point having a review if you haven't tackled the declassification policy as a foundational point. Am I totally out to lunch? I'm naive, I'm out to lunch, but man, oh man. Give me a good answer that I'll hold you to. I don't want to, you know, yes or no. Okay, here's one for you, Sean. Yes or no. No political response. I've watched that enough on TV. Will we have a declassification policy in the next 5 years?
I hope so.
Wow.
I mean, what I will say, I mean, if we're...
Does my question make sense? I mean...
Yes, if we're at Chatham House here, I think that, I think Charles did a very good job of enumerating the many challenges to get over the hurdle of putting in place a new policy framework. There's no question we're outliers in the Western world for not having a declassification policy. It's a toothache. It runs contrary to what the National Security Transparency Commitment is. This has been, galvanized me over the last few years to corral the community to at least, alleviate just these culture barriers that we have just in the process that we have today. When I look at something for injury, is DND looking at it differently? Is PCO looking at it differently? Can we trust one another enough to say, one organization reviews it, the deputy head, which is the accountable? That's the problem. Under the current framework, we're stuck with each silo of excellence, everyone choosing what's right for their organization. So the work we were doing is really to try to build that consensus. So at least in the interim, until there is a policy framework, we can say, when I'm reviewing a record, first of all, we might have a roster of people we can call in on as contractors to come and do the record review for us. That once that sort of accredited contractor does the work, that everybody agrees with the redactions that are being proposed, and then we put things out the door. Sadly, I'm not very optimistic about the time frame. I was quite disappointed, I guess, that I'm quite disappointed that we're still here in 2023 and we still don't have a decision in relation to where to from here. Every day we accrue more records that are going to be of the public interest 10 and 15 and 20 years from now. Are you listening, Charles?
Yes.
Take out the dollar out of your wallet.
But maybe to answer your the last question first, is when you said, where does the buck stop? Obviously, it's with elected officials. So as public servants, there's a mandate letter, and there's policies that we are working for, like I work for the President of the Treasury Board to accomplish her mandate. It's not my mandate. I may have personal views, but that's irrelevant in the context of the work. So when we're looking at that, the government, and I do think if you look over the past few years, there's been a lot of attention on transparency, openness, increasing disclosure of information. Even the Part 2 of the ATI Act, which we're one of the few jurisdictions that have that. So we went from a reactive ATI regime to including proactive disclosure, albeit of a limited list of things. But still, that is a substantial improvement from having something that was in policy that is now in law. And I do think that when I look at the conclusions of the report, like, those conclusions are strong. When it's the elected official that's putting out a report to Parliament saying there's benefit in looking at this. So I take that as a strong signal that there is they value that policy. And I think internally, what I see is a lot of activity that's contributing to that. And when you look outside at it's not only on national security records, which is the class, like when you're talking declassification, but when you're looking in other contexts, releasing or opening historical records. And this is where I think when you're talking about declassifying, what we're really talking about is opening historical records for public access or for
Well, it could be contemporary as well, because these are, classified documents are being produced every day.
But but my point is that right now what I see in the environment is pressure on many fronts, not just on narrow research front that was stated this morning where we don't have a big constituency. We see it with the records related to residential schools, opening that up and transferring that to Indigenous partners. So and there's also a number of litigation files that are pretty significant as well. So I think this notion of better managing and being able to open historical records is broadly acknowledged, and it's not maybe as niche as we think it is. So when we look at those policies and why I think the Access Act does provide kind of that foundation, if it's applied correctly, the problem is that not everybody applies it consistently and correctly. Like we've had, and I was talking to Jim Bronskill, like we have several decades of case law on the application of the Act. Not everybody's aware of that big, thick manual on how to apply the injury test. What are the criteria needed for that? So applying that more rigorously, you'd probably find that trying to protect information is harder than what you think, because the case law in some areas is very strong. And this is where I think the Commissioner's frustration in saying we have to go through that process to get there. But it's not necessarily, I don't think it's malintention on the part of anybody. In some cases, it's lack of training or lack of understanding of the way the Act's been applied and some of the guidance that's out there. But certainly, some of the work that we're doing is to increase training in the community, to increase consistency. I do think one of the testimony that struck me the most during the EPI study was, and I forget what official, but it was a high-ranking official in the national security space, and they were asked, well, why do we have to go to the States to get Canadian records? And her answer was very point blank and said, because we don't have a declassification regime. And like, that was it. That's all she, so I thought, like,
Doesn't that create a big question mark over your head?
But you know, I find that significant. It's, obviously I can't give you a yes or no answer, because I went on for a good 2 minutes now.
And Jim's in the audience.
Yeah.
Okay, listen, thank you very much.
Can you come and pick up the talking pen?
My question's not for Marcelle. I'm Brittany Long. I'm one of the archivists on Marcelle's declassification team. My question, and you might not be able to answer it, but I'm just wondering if there's been any discussion on, this is something that would be more like long-term helpful for declassification and information management. But I'm just wondering if there's been any discussion on creating like a cohesive and unified classification guidelines, so that way when classifications are being applied, it's the same across all government departments. They have to like take certain considerations in for like, it has to meet this to be confidential, it has to meet this to be secret, and you have to like give your reasoning as to why you are applying like a top secret classification to something, which might down the road help with declassification and access to this information when people are looking for it 30, 40, 50 years from now for stuff that's being created today. I'm just wondering if that's something that's been kind of thought about or discussed with.
Well, I could certainly, my policy colleagues in security policy have been looking at the categorization model, is what you're referring to. And in fact, when I was director of security policy, I was looking at the categorization model at one point. It's something that sounds simple enough to change, but when you really reflect on all of the impacts that could have, even internationally, where there has to be some kind of coherence between the Canadian model and others. Albeit right now, that coherence in the Canadian model isn't quite there, so there is reason to look at it. So I would just say, yeah, it is something that's being looked at, and I think that may assist in some areas, but as I know it, I think it's a combination of things. I don't think we need to kind of point to future action. I think there are actions we can take within the existing framework and applying it correctly, and I think that's what public safety is doing. When we're looking at the framework, and LAC is doing the same thing, is looking at that framework, breaking it down, and standardizing what that framework actually says, keeping in mind the sunset clauses that already exist. So already there, you know, there's certain blocks of information that after 20 years you can't apply that exemption. So having something that is able to guide the work like that is helpful. Right now, I think some of the, I know at TBS we have that automatic, every time you create a document, that little sensitivity thing comes up and it doesn't let you proceed unless you select a document. So obviously security training, and because the policy is clear, you're supposed to identify kind of the least level of security depending on the injury. You're not supposed to always have the highest, certainly taking into account the environment that comes with it. And I do think that's an area that can improve things. And it's a policy area, it's not legislative.
That's it. I might just add, this is an opportunity to talk about, you know, the part of the culture issue, I think, in government is the overclassification, or not taking the time when documents are created to really be sensitive to where the actual protections need to be in the document. obviously some types of products do it really well, like intelligence products, or every paragraph has a classification. But in other cases, particularly on the policy side of government, we tend to over classify everything. So if there's a seed of something that's top secret, you draw back, the whole document will become top secret. Writing for release is a drive that we've been trying to move towards, and to write for redaction, so that if the document is going to be, most of our national security apparatus is under the review of NSIRA, our National Security Intelligence Review Agency. Knowing where the sensitivities are at the outset is extremely important in order to maximize the transparency of those institutions. So we've been trying to drive that forward. A comprehensive declassification policy should address those sorts of questions.
You want to take the pen? Thank you.
Okay. I've got more of a question, or not as much of a question as a commentary about some of the things we've heard today is a great deal about greater access to security and intelligence records, and how we are the only country of the Five Eyes that doesn't have anything really set up. And I'm very much in favor and supportive of declassification, and as my colleagues at Library and Archives Canada know, and some of them have heard me say some of these things before. But when we're looking at security and intelligence records in our Five Eyes allies and how they're declassified, I'm told that there's nothing at the British National Archives post the Second World War, from GCHQ, from MI5 or MI6. So it's quite easy to say that everything that's sent there is open if you never sent anything there. At our friends to the south at the National Archives Records Administration, they established their National Declassification Center when it turned out that they accidentally opened up a few records. And so they set up the National Declassification Center to re-review those 300 million pages. After they finished reviewing those 300 million pages, they published a report which they said they successfully reviewed them. And as a result, out of those 300 million pages, 30 million were released. So they have a framework, they have something, they're in the Five Eyes. I think our friends in Australia, you won't find too many ASIO records out in their archives either. So it's by no means a panacea. And while I'd like very much to get more things declassified, I think we have to treat it with a certain consideration about the things that are in our way before we can go forward. Particularly in view of all of our interests in getting more security and intelligence records open. Thanks.
Does any one of you want to reply to that comment
I think it's a sharp observation.
Yeah, and thanks Daniel, and thanks everyone. Tim Sale. I want to just comment on this. Daniel's point actually sets up my question, and I guess in a way it's for everyone, but I guess last I'm going to direct it to you if that's okay, because I sort of lost, I guess, what's happening with the JIC files. And I'd be curious to know what's going forward there, and I guess on the disclosure side. And my question is about why we're exceptional, and I guess this is where Daniel was going too. But I'm a Canadian citizen, and I have been to Kew, the National Archives, where I can and have read UK Joint Intelligence Cabinet, UK JIC minutes. It's Cab 162. Anyone can see them. They're sanitized, but they're open. And also the supporting documents for the minutes. So the UK JIC, in the period we're talking about, those records are sanitized but open. And the Cabinet Office also hired an authorized historian to write a history of the UK JIC. So, and they didn't do it under declassification framework. The Cabinet Office decided that these records, Cabinet Office decided that there was value in these records being open, and so they transferred them to the archives, they sanitized them, and now they're open. So, I mean, as a Canadian historian, it makes me think that our government, for whatever reason, has decided that, it's not valuable for those records to be disclosed. And the question is, I guess, why we are sort of exceptional in this case. Why are we different? And I'm not asking you or anyone sort of at what level does the buck stop, like where's the problem, but is there, we've heard today there's cultural things in Canada. We've heard about sort of translation issues, two solitudes issues. We've heard about law. Lack of declassification framework might explain some, but not all. So why in Canada are we different on this? I'm just curious how, based on your experience.
Well, specifically on the JIP records, I think as I think Charles highlighted, there's no public interest disclosure ability. So I think if the UK did release the records under public interest disclosure, we didn't have the same mechanism to clear. And the JIC records have multiple deputy heads that have authorities under ATI. So they were reviewed under ATI effectively. I know that GAC went through and they did all of their work with the record set. I think they're sitting with the Department of Defense. It's entirely a capacity issue. We would like to finish that work and get them out under, maybe get them transferred to Library and Archives so they can go on to be handled and managed there. I think there's consensus to do that. It's really I think our last partner that has equities in the information is the Department of National Defense and needs to finish their work. It is happening. It's just I think the capacity challenges have made it a very slow process. I would just add that we focused in on that just because of the public interest in that record set that it raised many times. But we've gone out to the community and talked about what are those records requests by groups of people such as yourselves that have been sought and have been years in the production, so that we can prioritize. I think that's what the Library and Archives have been trying to do. They're trying to take what's in the current collection here to see which ones would be priorities for release. With the new powers of the Information Commissioner, I'm sure some of those will get auto release, or perhaps with litigation. We'll see. I'm doubtful. I'm doubtful that our national security community will be litigious about it. But because some of the records they have, as I said, there's very little persistent injury or tradecraft equities that are at play that would militate towards ongoing protection, to be honest. Especially when you get into the deep archive, like where we're talking pre-1970s records. There's not a lot that sustains, this tremendous mill that we have that does reaction to management of paper in order to do releases under ATI. So, but with hope, I am hopeful that record set will be, completed and it's the OIC complaint will be put to bed and will be out.
That said, Cal, you think that?
Maybe I would just acknowledge that it was mentioned this morning. I think it is an interesting idea, and it's one that's reflected in the open government policy documents, that you need this feedback loop, because I think for a long time just putting out information, regardless of whether that information was what was prioritized by the public. So I do think that is an important feedback loop, and finding mechanisms to put that in place for different stakeholders. I think that's an area that's really worth exploring, because if you're not an expert in an area, or you assume that information is useful or something is easy to process, and put that out but nobody uses it, well, maybe even if it was easy, that those efforts could have been used to something that is much more of value or valued by the stakeholders. So I did take note of that comment, and it is something that aligns with kind of the current policies and what's going on. It just needs to be reinforced and fostered. And so,
Sorry, just to follow up on this, the JIG records were sort of a sign of hope that things were actually moving, that there was some possibility that the system might recognize the need to start releasing records. So government has been working for 2 years or more on this pilot project, and it's still held up with departments that are unsure what to do with all this stuff. Where the reality is, many of these records, I can't say the exact proportion, but probably well over half, and maybe much more than that, have been released. First of all, some of them are already open at LIC in the late 40s, and many of the others have been released as part of the access campaign that we've been conducting. So those records are already out there, but the people who seem to be involved in the process inside government just aren't really aware of that. I mean, they're still focused very much on their internal government view that everything is classified, and they're just not aware of what's already out there. So I guess I'm just very disappointed, perhaps not surprised, that it has taken this long, and we're still working through this pilot project. And I guess, you know, the hope was that this would sort of set the groundwork for how other collections of documents could be released. But given the amount of time and effort in actually spinning the wheels and re-reviewing the stuff, I'm really not all that hopeful. So I mean, that's not the note I wanted to bring this discussion, you know, to an end to. But I mean, I think we need to recognize this is a real practical problem. A lot of this stuff is already out there, and the government is still spinning their wheels and trying to figure out what to do with all this stuff. So, sorry, that isn't much of a question.
That's okay. It deserves a response. So it is my understanding that we took stock if everything was already released. So when we gave a full accounting of that to all the departments that had equities, so it's the residual. So we're talking about at a high end, 18% of the entire record set has ongoing interest. It's those records that certain departments haven't been able to clear the deck on. Although they are working on it. So our consultant finished his work back in June of 2022, reported out to us, and the community has had a further in excess of a year to do their work. And as I said, there's been organizations that stepped right up and did their work. I don't think it's only D&D, I might be misspeaking, it might also be PCO that is also the laggard in this space. Suffice to say that, and you know, there's no sticks that I wield in my role that can sort of force the work to get done. And as I said, it's fundamentally capacity. I think the people that we speak to in the community who are in, you know, trying to work with the records and work with requesters, they are keen. Like they do not want, they don't want the burden of this, you know, this weight of having, you know, extremely long timelines and unsatisfied requesters. So I think there is goodwill in the system. It's just that it's at a systemic level, and it's that the tools, the legislative tools, don't really make for good outcomes. But have hope.
Shabu, Marcelle, anything to add? Okay, then we can move on to the next question.
Sorry, I promise I'll be brief. We're trying to wrap up. Okay. I thought it was interesting, Leslie, at the beginning of your presentation, you were talking about the Privy Council. I know one of the issues where we've also gone in a different direction from the Five Eyes more recently is the annual release of the federal cabinet minutes, which used to be an event that happened every year on January 1st in LIC. It got lots of press coverage, even well into the ATIP period, like not just in the old pre-ATIP regime. Those records stopped being transferred to the LAC, or they were delayed considerably after, you know, the end of the 2000s, beginning of the 2010s, and now when one just requests them at PCO, which I have done heavy redactions, whereas before they used to be open almost in their entirety. And I just think this is sort of an example of the dilemma that we're still in, and whether there'd be any kind of public interest override on records of that national importance. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I don't know if there's a kind of an easy answer to that. Certainly in the review, the issue of cabinet confidences was raised kind of prominently, and as I noted in my remarks, cabinet confidences reside kind of outside of just the Access to Information Act. The Canada Evidence Act covers cabinet confidences, certainly, and the Privy Council Office obviously has a lead policy role in that area. So when you're dealing with cabinet confidences, they're actually excluded from the Access to Information Act. And I think it's important to kind of let that sink in. So they're excluded from the Act. You can't, like, there's a process for reviewing to validate them, but they're excluded from the application of the Act. And they have exceptions to that. Certainly it's an area that was raised, but if you look at the Liberal dissenting opinion in the ETI report, you will see the government's policy or views on that expressed through that, and expressed in a pretty strong way. So it is an area that has come up repeatedly. I'm not sure kind of the path forward on that is from a policy perspective. All I was noting was the courts have provided guidance on some of this. So I think one of the things that as government officials we can do is ensure that the direction that's provided through case precedent is properly applied, that everyone who touches those documents is aware of the proper application of the provisions, and ensure that that is consistently done. And we are well aware, and it came up during the review and it came up during the testimony, that consistency in application of the Act is an issue. And it's something that policy, just putting out policy and saying apply it this way doesn't quite do it. We need to follow that up with training, which we're doing. And it's an area that, in terms of the overall policy, that's something that can probably benefit as well. Because some of those, there's a default security categorization that goes with some of those records that may not be in that same space.
Leslie or Marcelle, any comment? You?
Hi, this is a question for Charles. You mentioned an operational problem with like ATIP divisions. I think through a study or a report of some sort, you said there's a 20% vacancy in ATIP departments. And you did mention that a way to rectify that was by having better initiatives to gain employment in ATIP divisions. But to me, I was just wondering if it seems more like a problem of employee retention, and if that report or the study like looked at that problem of maybe trying to keep ATIP staff, or if you found that they were leaving and if there was recommendations on that basis.
Yeah, retention is definitely an issue for certain offices. Retention is definitely an issue for certain ATIP offices, but not all ATIP offices. Some ATIP offices can retain staff. What we've seen during the pandemic as well, there's a lot of movement, obviously. And I think some of the policies that were put in place were to try to rectify that and have more of a normalized working environment, so that you don't go to one department and another department offers something completely different. So that kind of helps in terms of making sure that that the retention issue isn't something that's kind of self-inflicted. It was really just a survey of the ATIP community, so we communicate with ATIP coordinators, and it wasn't like this big study. It's like how many positions you have open, and we did that a few years back, so we were validating the information from, I think it was 2021, which is about 20% down, and the same thing now. So what we're doing is collective recruitment efforts. So rather than every department put out a poster for entry-level positions, we're doing a collective process. So all departments contribute to that collective process, not just Treasury Board. All departments are contributing to that process, and basically putting up that community development office that's running these. And what we're leveraging there is the platform that the TBS has, a digital community office as well for IT professionals and that, and we're leveraging that platform. And that's provided, I think, well, certainly what we're getting back is we're getting back like a lot of interested applications. We just have to process that, sort of a bit of a victim of success there. Where when you get 500 plus, it's a bit difficult to go through. But I think that's positive in trying to fill positions across the system. In terms of retention, another factor, and what we've heard from ATIP offices, is entry level is one thing, but experienced ATIP analysts is another. So those analysts that are able to process files more quickly, have a better understanding of that, those are more difficult to retain because departments all want to keep those analysts. So when we do a recruitment campaign for that classification, so the more experienced analysts, you'll get analysts applying to go to another department where sometimes the backlog isn't as heavy, so in terms of just the work environment too. So those are problems that are difficult to resolve. Like, I know when I started out, I've been an ATIP analyst, and I started out at fisheries and oceans. You start off, things are nice, you have a reasonable amount of files, you get it done in a day, and then in our case it was the Marshall decision that brought a flood of requests, and then all of a sudden you have these requests that are like 20,000 pages, and that's one of your requests out of 30, and then you're like, I wonder if the workload is different at another department. So that's what I did. but that situation, it's almost, and you can imagine for departments that are going through kind of these workload challenges where it creates a bit of a spiral where the workload increases, people leave, the workload increases because people leave, and then you're trying to bring in people and say, the rumors are all around. It's a great place to be. So you have those challenges, and ATIP offices have those challenges. They're real, and I think kind of the solutions to that is getting people in and interested in ATIP. And we're also looking at more targeted recruitment because there's certain areas like historians are obviously kind of to jump into a field. My background was in history and law, so ATIP was a great place. And history, so it's like, great, this works. So that type of recruitment effort, and more targeted, I think, will contribute to retention as well, because you get some people coming in and then they start reviewing records all day and they're like, is this really what I'm going to be doing for the next 20 years? And it's like, well, yeah, that's kind of the job. So that has to play into it. You have to have candidates that are kind of enthused. They like that environment. Thank you very much.
I was just going to add, we made our records, the records world inside government kind of deprioritized with the advent of electronic information management systems and really underfunded records rooms, and got rid of departmental archivists and librarians, and all of this does conspire to a culture that doesn't really sort of honor the record, the importance of the record.
No,
so we have to build back up that.
Yeah, that's a very good point. time where we thought, well, if we implement the system,
No.
that would solve it.
Spend all the money over there, not over
So
here.
let's be careful with the AI craze that's going on.
Not sure if that actually works.
So, unfortunately, we are going to have to wrap up this session. There's a lot of other, so thank you very much. There's a lot of other questions I think we could have tried to tackle. One question, we're not going to open it up, but that I would have liked to hear a bit more about is the issue of culture. Right? So we talked about capacity issues, you talked about legislative change or not. But Leslie, in your remarks, you talked about overclassification, which, as you know, is one issue that I find very interesting and problematic in many ways. How do you change culture? Training, I've never been convinced that that can get that much done. Hiring different kinds of people, easy to say, but hard to do. Other ways, changing incentive structures, again, easy to say, but hard to do. So that's one issue that I hope we could have, maybe in another forum, talk about a bit more. The other very quick point that I mentioned, in answer to your question or point, which was very well said, there's always a tendency to view the grass as greener elsewhere. We tend to do that a lot in this country on a number of issues. On some aspects of transparency, declassification, ATI, some of our allies do better. And I think that's clearly true. In some cases, much better, but not all the time. And it's important to say that we're not all bad. About a year and a half ago, I gave a presentation on national security transparency to the French intelligence community. And let me tell you, the eye rolling, the smirks, and I was talking about some of the stuff that the Cyber Center at CSE does, the Academic Outreach and Stakeholder Engagement Branch at CSIS does, and they do very good work. And to the French, that was a different planet. So the DGSE and DGSE folks were just, they don't talk to this is. So in some cases, we do well. And I think it is important to say that. We could and should do better, but it's not all negative. And sometimes outside commentators may tend to overemphasize the negative, but it's important to mention the two sides. On that, we will have to stop. So thank you very much. Who will deliver closing remarks.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Okay, good. Okay, thanks, Tim. Well, I want to begin by thanking LAC for hosting this event and the organizers for giving us such a rich program. And I particularly want to mention Alan Barnes, without whom this event really wouldn't have gone forward. Thank you for your efforts. Now, I think I'm not going to try to recapitulate everything that's being said here today. That would be very difficult and very time-consuming. I am going to offer, perhaps in a bit of a departure from what remarks of this sort are generally like, a few observations looking at what some of our sister democracies, particularly the United States and the United Kingdom, have done. Now, as we just heard, they're not perfect, but on some points they do better than we, and we can learn from the experience of others. And I'm reminded first of the British experience. Before the 1990s, research into British intelligence history was pretty difficult, though there were important and praiseworthy books done. This did change some in 1992 with the Open Government Initiative sponsored by William Waldegrave and Douglas Hurd, which released a lot of material to the PRO as it then was. And as Richard Aldrich of the University of Nottingham has noted, in his dealings with the media, Waldegrave really highlighted the fact that this would cover a lot of intelligence material. And that helped generate a lot of interest, not just among policymakers and historians, but among the press and even the general public. And as a result of that initiative, we did enhance our understanding of a number of important intelligence topics. We revised our understanding of the role of Ultra in the Second World War, and we even learned about the British military mission in the GDR, which gave us a unique picture of British intelligence on the front lines of the Cold War. And then in 2005, the Freedom of Information Act took effect. And this created a general right of access to official information. Now, the intelligence services were explicitly exempt from this legislation, which is one of its gravest flaws. But much about intelligence matters could be found out from material that was included. As my one-time MA supervisor, John Ferris, observed, material other than the records of intelligence services can actually tell you a fair bit about intelligence if you know where to look. In the US case, in an article published in the journal Diplomatic History in 1989, the great Cold War historian John Lewis Gaddis observed that a fair amount, even then, a fair amount of end product intelligence analyses for the Cold War period were available. But the sources on which these were based were much less accessible. It is my suspicion and my experience to some extent that in the Canadian case too, the further you get from the end product, the slimmer the pickings get. And until this situation is remedied, our understanding of the role that intelligence has played in our history is going to be severely inadequate, woefully incomplete. Gaddis also warned us to beware of the fact that intelligence history is highly susceptible to what he called buffism, the tendency to seize upon the sensational detail or the lurid revelation, often to the detriment of the broader context. And this, I think, is something that we need to be aware of, particularly when we look at the respective benefits of systematic declassification and ad hoc leaking. The last report I want to refer to is the 1997 report of the Commission on Protecting and Reducing Government Secrecy, better known as the Moynihan Report, after its chairman, the New York Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And this report resulted in declassification of most of the material pertaining to the Venona Project, greatly enriching our understanding of American SIG in the Cold War. And that document, the Moynihan Report, bears reading today for its analysis, much of which is relevant to the Canadian case. Moynihan made the commonplace observation that secrecy is not only corrosive of democratic accountability and informed debate among the citizenry as well as policymakers, but that when carried to extremes, it is ultimately self-defeating. Bureaucratic empires, like the territorial kind, are vulnerable to what Paul Kennedy called imperial overstretch. And the more encompassing, the more arbitrary a regime of secrecy is, the more, in fact, it is likely to be defied upon occasion, not necessarily in ways that are sensible or healthy. The wider, the more dubious the claims made on behalf of official secrecy, the more likely those subjected to them are to turn and blab. And to this, I would add another point Gaddis makes. The systematic declassification of the relevant records is in fact less likely to be harmful to the national interest and indeed the reputation of intelligence services themselves than ad hoc leaks. Secrecy can never be total, and it's always likely to be undone by the efforts of either enterprising journalists or inventive memoirists. Those of us of a certain age can remember the lurid revelations, some totally fictitious, contained in Patrick Wright's Spycatcher in 1987, among them the charge that the one-time Director General of MI5 had been a Soviet mole. Despite the best efforts of the Thatcher government to suppress it, the book became a worldwide bestseller, and its author died a relatively wealthy man. Reality is always going to be outstripped by inventive fabulists, and those who wish to paint intelligence services as malign, and those who see them as congenitally incompetent, are going to benefit. Keep too much information under wraps, and you risk being thought either more malevolent or more stupid than you actually were. Thus, accelerated declassification of intelligence records is really in the interest of everybody. not least the intelligence services themselves. And the wider the acceptance of that fact, the sooner we can go about filling in the gaps in the historical record. And finally, I'd like to second the observation made by others today. Without some sort of a wider cultural change, from a culture of secrecy to a culture of openness, without some presumption in favor of disclosure, the discrete reforms and initiatives that we've talked about today are likely to avail relatively little, because they will be sabotaged in the absence of such a culture of openness. On that note, I want to thank you, and I want to turn things over to Alan for his thank you.
Well, I just want to take a couple of minutes to say again, thank you all for participating in this, for being part of the discussion. I think it's very useful to have such a wide range of people in the room together, so it's not only us researchers complaining about things, it's people who actually know how the system works, the archivists, the access to information officials, and others who are interested in this issue. So I think it's very important to have this kind of conversation, have this group of people together to talk about these things, and I hope that any of the conversations that we started today will continue, both among the groups within government, working together and hopefully learning from each other, because I think there's some real lessons that can be learned. A lot of the organizations in government are now becoming much more competent in handling these kinds of historical records, so I think those lessons are very useful. And also just to continue the conversations between researchers and government. I think throughout our discussion today, it's always been emphasized that anytime there are those discussions, conversations on specific requests or assistance from archivists and so on, it's always been beneficial on both sides, and so everybody understands each other much better. So again, thank you for participating, thank you for contributing, and hopefully this will be sort of a starting point for further progress in this direction. Thanks.
Will you send me an email? Yeah. Yeah, okay. We'll be in touch. Good luck finishing up with the rating. Okay, thanks. Thanks.